The heavy mahogany dining table was set for 12, covered in my best linen and sparkling crystal. We had just finished a beautiful family dinner when my mother-in-law slammed a thick manila folder right in the center of it. Her name was Eleanor, and she stood at the head of the table with her hands planted firmly on the wood. With perfectly manufactured tears in her eyes, she loudly announced that she had uncovered a devastating truth. She claimed I was a monster. She claimed I was funneling thousands out of her son's business accounts and carrying on a sordid affair. To prove it, she pointed at the folder and dramatically pulled a cheap burner phone from her designer handbag. The entire extended family was frozen in absolute shock. My husband, Mark, sat next to me, his face completely drained of color. His eyes just kept darting frantically between his mother, the folder, and me. The silence in the room was so absolute that I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Eleanor looked at me with this mix of profound sorrow and vicious, triumphant glee. She really thought she had won. There's a specific kind of coldness that washes over you when you realize someone is actively trying to destroy your life. It doesn't feel like a panic attack. It feels like clarity. I didn't feel the urge to scream or cry. I just felt peace. Because after 5 years of psychological warfare, after 5 years of being made to feel like I was crazy and paranoid, her mask had finally slipped in front of everyone. She had no idea I already knew everything. But to understand the sheer magnitude of this standoff, I have to take you back to the beginning. I have to explain how a woman who smiled at my wedding slowly and ruthlessly tried to dismantle my reality. When I first met Mark, I thought I had found the perfect man. He was a brilliant, hard-working architect, and I was an independent graphic designer running my own agency. We balanced each other perfectly. But there was always a shadow hovering just over his shoulder, and her name was Eleanor. She was a wealthy widow with an intense, suffocating attachment to her only son. She didn't see me as a partner. She saw me as a threat. I remember that first dinner so clearly. We went to this upscale Italian place downtown. I was a nervous wreck. She showed up late, kissed Mark, and basically pretended I didn't exist. For the first 20 minutes, she completely ignored me. She just interrogated Mark about his job, his diet, and his grooming habits. I sat there, trying to keep a polite smile plastered on. When she finally looked at me, she gave this tight, fake smile that didn't reach her eyes. She asked what I did for a living, looking at me like a bug under a microscope. She gave this soft, patronizing little laugh. She said it was cute that young women could have their little hobbies. Then she actually asked what my backup plan was to support a husband. Over the next 3 years, she became a master of plausible deniability. I'd host a holiday dinner and she'd show up with her own food, loudly announcing my cooking might upset Mark's stomach. It was relentless. Mark bought me a beautiful necklace for my birthday once. She made a huge show of examining it, loudly saying how sweet it was he spent money on something so flashy. Whenever I tried to talk to Mark about it, he'd immediately get defensive. He'd tell me I was reading too much into things, reminding me how much she sacrificed for him. He just begged for patience. Wedding planning was a total nightmare. She tried to control every detail. The absolute worst part was my final dress fitting. She actually showed up holding a silver gown that looked exactly like a wedding dress. My older sister, Sarah, finally put a stop to it. Sarah's a corporate lawyer who doesn't put up with garbage. She stepped right in and calmly told Eleanor a tray of red wine would mysteriously ruin that dress. Eleanor backed down immediately. She knew she couldn't bully Sarah, but when she thought no one was looking, she turned and glared at me. That look of pure, unadulterated hatred literally chilled me to the bone. Despite all that stress, the wedding actually went off without a hitch. Mark and I were so happy, and for that first year, things really seemed to calm down. We were just focused on our careers and building a life together. But that peace was a total illusion. The real war started the second we bought our house. It was this gorgeous mid-century modern place we'd saved up years for. Eleanor absolutely hated it, mostly because it was 30 minutes away from her. The day we moved in, she showed up with a housewarming gift. It was this massive, incredibly ugly antique grandfather clock that didn't match anything we owned. She insisted it had to go right in the center of the living room. I politely suggested it might look better in the guest room, and she immediately burst into tears. She started wailing about how I was rejecting her family heritage. Mark panicked, took her side, and put the clock exactly where she wanted it. But the clock wasn't even the real issue. Right before she left, she held out her hand and casually asked Mark for a spare key. She played it off like she just needed it for emergencies or to water the plants. I stepped right in and said absolutely not. I told her we had a keypad lock and could just give her a code if there was a real emergency. The thought of that woman having unrestricted access to my home made my skin crawl. She looked incredibly offended, but she finally dropped it and left. I honestly thought that was the end of it. I thought I'd actually set a firm boundary. I had no idea what Mark was about to do. 3 days later, Mark couldn't handle his mom's relentless guilt trips anymore. He secretly went down to the hardware store and had a spare key cut for our back door. He convinced himself it was just a harmless compromise to keep the peace. He handed that key right over to her without telling me a thing. He actually assumed she'd never use it unless there was a real emergency. He severely underestimated just how obsessed his mother was with controlling us. A few months later, these tiny, weird things started happening around the house. I'd leave my favorite fountain pen right on my desk in the home office. And the next morning, it would just be gone. 3 days later, I'd find that exact same pen tossed at the bottom of a random kitchen drawer. It made absolutely 0 sense. I just figured I was being careless. Then it started happening with my actual work. I'd meticulously organize my client files alphabetically before going to bed. But the next morning, I'd find the folders slightly out of order. It wasn't just my office either. I bought this brand new jar of really expensive moisturizer and used it exactly once. The next time I opened it, half the jar was completely gone. At first, I genuinely blamed myself for all of it. I thought I was just super overwhelmed by the new house. I figured the stress of running my business was finally making me forgetful. I'd ask Mark if he had accidentally moved my things around. He would always say no, looking at me with this weird mix of confusion and genuine concern. It made me feel even crazier. But then, the incidents started to escalate beyond just misplaced items. One afternoon, I came home from a meeting and the house felt like an oven. The thermostat was cranked to 80 degrees. I distinctly remembered turning the heat down before I left. Another time, I walked into the kitchen and froze. A burner on the stove was glowing red hot with nothing on it. I completely panicked. I was terrified that I could have burned our brand new house to the ground. I honestly thought I was losing my mind or developing some sort of early onset memory issue. I broke down crying to Mark that night. I was completely overwhelmed by the fear that my own brain was failing me. I just sobbed into his chest, desperate for him to make it okay. Mark held me, but when I looked up, I saw this flicker of doubt in his eyes. He gently suggested I was taking on too much. He actually told me to see a therapist. I felt like the ground was shifting right beneath my feet. My own home was supposed to be my sanctuary. Instead, it had turned into this terrifying house of mirrors. The absolute breaking point happened during a massive week for my business. I was prepping this huge branding presentation for the biggest client I'd ever landed. I spent weeks on the physical portfolio, printing these high-quality mock-ups and binding them perfectly. I left them neatly stacked right on my office desk the night before the big pitch. The next morning, I went in to grab the portfolio. 3 of the most critical pages were just missing. They weren't misplaced. They were completely gone. I frantically searched the entire house. I was tearing apart my office, digging through the trash cans, checking the living room. I found absolutely nothing. I had to walk into that meeting with an incomplete presentation. I stumbled through the whole pitch looking completely flustered and unprofessional. And I lost the contract. I came home completely devastated. I just sat on the floor of my office and cried until I couldn't even breathe. But as I sat there staring at the empty space on my desk, this sudden, chilling thought pierced right through the despair. I hadn't lost those pages. Someone had taken them. I thought about the stove, the thermostat, the rearranged files. I realized these things only ever happened on days when Mark was at the office and I had stepped out. I picked up my phone and called my sister, Sarah. I didn't tell her I thought I was going crazy. I just laid out the facts for her, exactly like evidence in a trial. Sarah listened quietly, never interrupting. When I finished, she didn't tell me I was stressed or forgetful. She simply asked if Eleanor had a key to our house. I told her no, absolutely not. I had forbidden it. Sarah paused and told me to check Mark's keychain the next time he came home. She wanted me to see if the spare key we kept in the kitchen junk drawer was still there. I hung up the phone, feeling a sickening knot forming in my stomach. I went straight to the kitchen and opened the junk drawer. I pushed aside the old batteries and takeout menus. The spare back door key was gone. When Mark came home that evening, I waited until I heard the shower running. I crept out and checked his briefcase and his jacket pockets. I was desperate to find it, hoping I was wrong. Nothing. Then I checked his keychain. I flipped through the house key, the car key, the office fob. There was no spare key. I confronted him right then and there. I walked into the bathroom, turned off the shower, and demanded to know where the spare key was. Mark froze. The guilt on his face was immediate and undeniable. He stammered, he deflected, and finally he confessed. He told me he had given it to his mother months ago. I felt a profound, shattering sense of betrayal. My own husband had compromised the safety of our home to appease his mother. He swore she had never used it, but I knew better. A terrifying realization washed over me. It wasn't me. I wasn't losing my mind. Eleanor was coming into my house when I wasn't there. She was systematically gaslighting me to make me look unhinged. Mark begged for my forgiveness and promised to get the key back the very next day. But then he told me I was overreacting to suggest his mother was sneaking in. He actually called the idea paranoid. That was the exact moment I realized arguing with Mark was completely pointless. Without hard proof, I was just the hysterical, paranoid wife accusing his saintly mother of a bizarre conspiracy. I had to stop crying and start thinking like my sister. I had to become cold, calculating, and absolutely undeniable. So I looked at Mark and told him to just let it go. I lied and said I was probably just stressed from work and imagining things. I let him believe he had calmed me down. But the very next morning, the second Mark walked out the door, my entire demeanor changed. I didn't waste a single minute. I picked up my phone and called a highly rated private security firm. I didn't want cheap, obvious cameras. I needed absolute discretion. Over the next 2 days, while Mark was away on a fishing trip, I had a professional technician come to the house. He installed 6 state-of-the-art motion-activated hidden cameras everywhere. They were completely invisible to the naked eye. One camera was built into a digital alarm clock, and another was disguised as a smoke detector. We put one in a phone charger in the kitchen, plus cameras in my office, the living room, and pointing right at the back door. Everything recorded directly to a private cloud server. Once the cameras were active, the hardest part began. The waiting. I had to pretend everything was perfectly normal and smile at Mark over dinner. I even had to answer Eleanor's sickly, sweet phone calls and pretend I didn't know she was a monster. It took 2 agonizing weeks for the trap to finally spring. It was a Tuesday, and Mark was at the office. I told him I had a full day of meetings in the city, but I actually went straight to Sarah's apartment. I opened my laptop, logged into the security feed, and watched. At exactly 11:45 in the morning, my phone buzzed. It was a motion alert from the backdoor camera. My heart slammed against my ribs as I clicked the notification. The live video feed filled my screen, and there she was. It was Eleanor. She unlocked the back door with her secret key, stepped into the mudroom, and carefully wiped her feet. She wasn't carrying a purse. Instead, she was clutching a thick manila folder and a small black rectangular object. Sarah and I sat in absolute silence, watching the feed as Eleanor moved through my house. She didn't look like a mother dropping off a gift. Chilling comparison. She looked like a professional burglar. Her movements were precise, practiced, and terrifyingly calm. We watched the feed as she strolled right into my kitchen. She casually opened the refrigerator, poked around for a second, and then deliberately left the freezer door cracked open. Just enough to ruin all the food, but not enough to trigger the alarm beeps. Then she made her way into my home office. The hidden camera we'd tucked inside the smoke detector captured her perfectly from above. She sat right down at my desk and pulled my laptop open. She pulled a tiny scrap of paper out of her pocket and started typing. To my absolute horror, the screen lit up and unlocked. She had somehow figured out my password. For 20 agonizing minutes, she just sat there at my computer. I watched her open my browser and intentionally poison my search history. She was looking up luxury vacation rentals in Paris, high-end men's watches, and top-tier divorce attorneys. Next, she opened that thick manila folder she'd brought with her. She pulled out a stack of papers and slipped them into the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. She wedged them right between my old tax returns where I wouldn't notice them. I zoomed in on the camera feed as much as I could, trying to make out the text. I couldn't read the actual documents from that angle. But honestly, I didn't need to. I knew she was planting a bomb in my office. Finally, she stood up and walked back out to the mudroom. She stopped right in front of the coat rack and reached into her pocket. She pulled out a cheap black prepaid burner phone, turned it on, and actually smiled to herself. She checked the screen one last time, then slipped it deep into the inner pocket of my heavy winter coat. A coat I wouldn't even wear for another 3 months. She patted the pocket to make sure it was hidden. then walked out the back door. I sat there in Sarah's living room, staring at the frozen frame of Eleanor leaving my house. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was just pure volcanic anger. She wasn't just trying to make me look crazy anymore. She was framing me. She was orchestrating this whole narrative to destroy my marriage and my reputation in one blow. Sarah just placed a hand on my shoulder and looked at me with this cold, professional determination. She said, "We have her. Now we let her hang herself." I went home that night and acted like everything was totally fine. Mark was annoyed about the freezer door being left open and ruining the meat. I just played dumb, apologized, and helped him clean up the mess. The next day, as soon as Mark left for work, I put on some gloves. I went straight to my home office and opened the filing cabinet. I carefully pulled out the papers Eleanor had hidden in there. I took out my phone and photographed every single page of her little setup. I made sure to get crystal clear shots of everything. Then I put them back exactly where I found them, down to the millimeter. The documents were honestly a masterpiece of malicious forgery. She had fake bank statements showing massive transfers to an offshore account in my name. There were even fake credit card bills for men's clothing and expensive hotel rooms. After dealing with the papers, I went out to the hallway. I reached into my heavy winter coat and pulled out that cheap burner phone. I just stood there for a second, holding it in my gloved hands. I pressed the power button and waited for it to boot up. The screen lit up, showing dozens of unread text messages. They were all from a contact saved simply as David. The messages were sickeningly romantic, talking about our secret meetings and running away together. Eleanor had literally sat down and texted this phone from another number. She fabricated an entire imaginary affair just to ruin me. I slipped the phone right back into the coat pocket where she left it. Then I went back to my computer and uploaded all the photos to my secure server. Everything was backed up and totally undeniable. After that, all I could do was wait for Eleanor to make her move. I knew she wouldn't just show the stuff to Mark in private. She was a narcissist who needed an audience. She wanted to publicly humiliate me in front of the whole family. The perfect opportunity was coming up fast. Mark's 35th birthday was in 2 weeks, and I was hosting a massive dinner party. For 2 whole weeks, I had to live with a ghost. I slept next to a husband who had no idea his mother was a predator. I talked to Sarah every single day, fine-tuning our game plan. I didn't just want to prove Eleanor was a liar. I wanted to expose the absolute rot at her core. Which brings us right back to that mahogany table. The dinner was beautiful. The wine was flowing, and Mark looked so genuinely happy. We'd just finished the cake. Then Eleanor stood up. She tapped her spoon against her crystal glass, demanding everyone's attention. She put on this sweet, trembling voice, saying it broke her heart to share terrible news. The whole room went dead silent. Mark looked so confused, asking her what was going on. And that's when she slammed that thick manila folder right onto the table. Then she dramatically pulled that cheap burner phone out of her designer bag. She launched right into her performance, telling the family she'd suspected something was wrong for months. She claimed I'd been acting distant, secretive, and totally obsessed with money. She told everyone that out of pure maternal concern, she'd actually hired a private investigator. She pointed a shaking finger at the folder. She declared it held solid proof that I was embezzling money from Mark's firm to fund some lavish double life. Then she pointed at the phone. She claimed her fake investigator found it and that it was full of explicit texts proving I was having an affair with a guy named David. The family was stunned. Mark looked like he'd just been physically struck. He stared at the folder, then at the phone, and slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were wide and pleading, begging me to laugh and say it was a joke. Seeing that momentary doubt in his eyes hurt worse than anything Eleanor had done. Seeing that doubt in his eyes hurt worse than anything Eleanor had done. But I couldn't let my emotions take over. Not yet. I looked up at Eleanor, who was practically glowing with this vicious, triumphant energy. She stared right down at me from the head of the table. She told me it was time to pack my bags and get out of her son's house. She actually said she wasn't gonna let me destroy him. I didn't scream. I didn't cry or try to frantically defend myself. I just took a really slow, deep breath. Then I picked up my linen napkin and folded it perfectly. I set it down on the table, keeping my movements totally relaxed. I didn't raise my voice at all. I just looked her dead in the eye and told her she had a very compelling story. But I let her know there was one tiny little problem with her evidence. Then I reached right into my pocket. I pulled out my own phone and unlocked it. With just a couple of taps, I opened up my hidden security app. I connected my screen straight to the massive smart TV mounted on the wall right behind her. The giant screen flickered to life, casting this bright glow over the dining room. I didn't say another word to her, or anyone else. I just pressed play. The high-def video completely filled the room, and the audio was crystal clear. The whole family just froze in this stunned, breathless silence. They were staring at footage of our back door. Everyone watched as the deadbolt clicked open from the outside. And then, Eleanor walked right into the frame. You could hear this massive, collective gasp ripple across the entire table. Mark leaned forward, his mouth literally falling open in shock. Up on the screen, his mother was casually wiping her feet, and she was holding the exact same manila folder that was sitting right in front of us. The video cut to the kitchen camera. The whole family watched as their beloved matriarch opened the freezer and deliberately left it ajar. Then the video cut to my home office. They watched Eleanor sit right at my desk. She typed in my password and started scrolling through my computer. They watched her take those forged documents out of her folder. Then she carefully hid them right inside my filing cabinet. But the most damning piece of evidence was still coming. The video cut to the hallway. The camera caught Eleanor standing right in front of the coat rack. She reached into her pocket and pulled out that cheap black burner phone. It was the exact same phone she had just presented to the table. The camera was close and the microphone was sensitive. As she turned it on to check the fake messages she sent herself, you could hear her humming. She was humming a cheerful little tune. She slipped the phone deep into my coat pocket. She gave it a little pat, and then she just walked out. I paused the video on the final frame of Eleanor smiling as she hid it. The silence in that dining room was heavy. It was suffocating and absolute. It was the kind of silence after a bomb goes off, leaving everyone completely deafened. Nobody moved a muscle. Nobody said a word. I slowly stood up from my chair. I looked around at the stunned faces of Mark's extended family, and then I looked right at Eleanor. The color completely drained from Eleanor's face. Her makeup suddenly looked like a grotesque mask. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. That triumphant gleam was replaced by stark terror. I walked right over to the table. I picked up that thick manila folder, and I tossed it right back down in front of her. The sound echoed in the dead silent room. Then I picked up the cheap burner phone. I didn't hand it to her. I just dropped it directly into her lap. She flinched as it landed on her expensive suit. I kept my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of any anger. I looked her dead in the eye. I told her there was no private investigator. I said, "You forged those bank statements yourself." I laid out exactly what she did, how she texted herself fake love letters to fabricate an affair, and how she used the key Mark secretly gave her to break into my home and plant the evidence. I told her she didn't do this to protect Mark. She did it because she couldn't stand that he loved someone else. She wanted to destroy my life and my marriage right in front of everyone. Saying in a natural American voice, watching her crumble, Eleanor started to stammer. Her carefully constructed facade was completely shattered. She looked wildly around the room for an ally. She looked at Aunt Carol and Uncle David, but they just stared back at her with profound disgust. Her eyes finally landed on Mark. She reached out a shaking hand toward him, tears of genuine panic streaming down her face. She begged him to understand, claiming she was only trying to protect him. Mark slowly stood up from his chair. He looked physically ill. He had spent his life defending this woman, but now he was finally seeing the truth, looking right at the monster behind the curtain. Mark looked at the paused TV screen, then down at his mother. When he spoke, his voice wasn't sad. It was shaking with a deep, terrifying rage. He said, "You broke into my home. You tried to frame my wife." Eleanor finally broke down. Panicked tears streamed down her face as she reached out to grab Mark's arm. She sobbed that she was his mother and that she was just confused. But Mark didn't comfort her. He stepped back sharply, ripping his arm away from her grasp like her touch physically burned him. The disgust in his eyes was absolute. He stood there, his chest heaving with a mix of total betrayal and fury. He raised a shaking hand, pointed straight toward the front door, and told her to get out. Eleanor froze. She stared at him in sheer disbelief, completely unable to process that her own son was kicking her out. She whimpered, saying he couldn't do this to family. Mark's voice dropped to a cold, hard whisper that cut right through the room. He looked her dead in the eye and said she wasn't his family anymore. She was evil. He promised her that if she ever came near our house again, he'd take the footage straight to the cops. He'd have her arrested for breaking and entering. The devastation on Eleanor's face was absolute. She had built her whole identity around being this revered family matriarch. In minutes, she was exposed as a malicious criminal. She looked around the table, begging for a shred of sympathy, but people literally turned their chairs away. With shaking hands, she grabbed her designer bag, leaving the fake evidence. She stood up, and her rigid theatrical posture completely crumbled. Stripped of all her power and that fake Southern charm, she suddenly looked 10 years older than when she arrived. Without another word, she turned and walked out. We watched in total silence as she moved down the hallway. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, echoing through the house. After she walked out, the whole dinner party just dissolved. People quietly grabbed their coats and whispered their apologies to me. Nobody really knew what to say. Once the last guest slipped out into the night, it was just Mark and me left in the ruins of the evening. The silence in the house was absolutely deafening. Mark walked into the living room and completely collapsed onto the sofa. He put his head in his hands and just started to weep. He was crying for the mother he thought he had, and for the sheer horror of what she almost pulled off. I didn't rush over to comfort him. I just let him cry. I needed him to feel the full, crushing weight of his actions. Eleanor was the villain, sure, but Mark was the one who handed her the weapon. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were completely red and swollen. He begged for my forgiveness, telling me how incredibly sorry he was for not believing me. He apologized for giving her that spare key and letting things get this far. He swore he'd spend the rest of his life making it up to me, and that he'd cut her off permanently. I looked down at my husband. I told him that I loved him, but that love just wasn't enough anymore. The trust in our marriage was fundamentally broken. I laid out my conditions right then and there. We were going to therapy, and we were changing the locks the very next morning. I told him if he ever spoke a single word to that woman again, I'd leave him and take the house. He agreed to every single condition without hesitation. He knew he almost lost everything. It's been 2 years since that dinner party, and things are completely different. Mark actually kept his word. He changed his number the very next day, and we put in a brand new security system. He hasn't spoken to his mom since the night he kicked her out. The fallout with the rest of the family was massive. Aunt Carol and Uncle David cut her off completely. The story of what she did spread like wildfire through her social circle. It totally stripped away that pristine reputation she cared so much about. Now she lives in that huge house, completely isolated. Mark and I had to do a lot of hard work to rebuild our marriage. It definitely wasn't easy. We spent months in therapy, digging up resentment and rebuilding our trust. Because we put in the work, our home is finally a real sanctuary. That heavy shadow Eleanor cast over us is gone for good. I can actually relax in my own house now. Looking back on everything, I don't even feel angry anymore. Honestly, I just feel empowered. I survived a massive psychological attack by staying calm and sticking to the truth. I let the truth burn her illusions to the ground. If you're dealing with someone who gaslights you and messes with your reality, listen up. Open a new page in Karma's diary and write down these 3 lessons. Lesson 1. Your intuition is your greatest protector. Never let anyone convince you you're crazy. When boundaries get crossed and you feel that weird anxiety, you gotta listen to your gut. Toxic people thrive in that space between your gut instinct and your need to be polite. Warning, they rely on you giving them the benefit of the doubt. Stop doing it. If someone makes you feel crazy, you aren't the problem. Don't ignore red flags just because they're family. Lesson 2. Silence and strategy are way more powerful than anger. When someone tries to ruin you, your first instinct is to scream. Don't do it. Confronting them just gives a narcissist exactly what they want. They want a stage, a big reaction, and a chance to spin the whole story. They'll use your anger to paint you as the crazy one. Instead, you've got to go completely quiet. Just become an observer. Gather your evidence meticulously, legally, and in a way they can't deny. Build yourself an ironclad fortress of truth. And when the time finally comes to expose them, don't do it with emotion. You hit them with cold, hard, indisputable facts. Because the absolute most devastating weapon you can use against a liar is silent, undeniable proof. Let the evidence do all the talking for you. Lesson 3. The people who truly love you will protect your peace. They'll do it, even if it means standing up to their own blood. Honestly, the hardest part of this whole ordeal wasn't even Eleanor's betrayal. It was Mark's initial failure to protect our boundaries. That's what really broke my heart. A partner who dismisses your discomfort just to keep the peace with their toxic family? They're choosing their own comfort over your safety. And you can't live like that. True love requires the courage to draw hard lines in the sand. If someone wants to share a life with you, they've got to be willing to defend it. They have to protect it against anyone who threatens it. You deserve a partner who acts as your absolute shield. Never, ever settle for anything less than that. You're worth so much more. Stay strong and always protect your sanctuary. Just remember, karma always has the final word. The diary is officially closed. I paused the video right on the final frame of Eleanor smiling. The silence in that dining room was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It was the silence of a bomb having just gone off. No one moved, and no one spoke a single word. I slowly stood up from my chair and looked at the stunned faces of Mark's extended family. Then I looked directly at Eleanor. She went completely pale. Her perfectly applied makeup suddenly looked like a grotesque mask. Her mouth was opening and closing, but no sound was coming out. The triumphant gleam in her eyes had been completely replaced by stark, naked terror. She was staring at the TV screen like it was a monster that had just crawled out of the floorboards. I walked over, picked up the manila folder, and tossed it right back down in front of her. Then I picked up the burner phone and dropped it into her lap. I kept my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of any anger or malice. I told her there was no private investigator. I said, you forged those statements and bought that phone. You sat at home texting yourself fake love letters. Then you used the secret key to break in and plant them. You didn't do this to protect Mark. You did this because you can't stand the fact that he loves someone else more than he relies on you. You wanted to destroy my life, my marriage, and my reputation in front of everyone I care about. Eleanor started to stammer, looking wildly around the room, desperately searching for an ally. Cold reality. She looked at the extended family, but they were staring at her with profound disgust. They were looking at her like they had never actually seen her before. Finally, her eyes landed on Mark. She reached out a shaking hand toward him and started crying. She begged him, saying she had to show him the truth to protect him, claiming I was taking him away from her. Mark slowly stood up, looking physically ill. The man who had spent his entire life defending this woman and making excuses for her was finally seeing the truth. Dark revelation. He was finally seeing the monster behind the curtain. He looked at the TV screen, then at the folder, and finally down at his mother. When he spoke, his voice was shaking with a deep, terrifying rage. He told her she broke into his home and tried to frame his wife. He said she tried to destroy his marriage just because she was jealous. Eleanor completely lost it, sobbing these actual genuine tears of panic. She tried grabbing Mark's arm, crying about how she was his mother and did everything for him. She kept pleading that she was just confused, hoping her usual guilt trip would work. Mark stepped back so fast, pulling his arm away like her touch literally burned him. He raised the shaking finger and pointed straight toward the front door. He didn't yell. He just told her to get out. Eleanor just froze, staring at him in total disbelief. She started whimpering, begging him to change his mind. She kept crying that this was her family and he couldn't possibly do this to her. Mark's voice dropped to this cold, hard whisper that just cut through the room. He told her she was sick, evil, and absolutely not his family anymore. He swore if she ever came near us again, he'd take the footage straight to the cops. The devastation on her face was just absolute. She'd built her whole identity around being this revered, respected matriarch. But in a matter of minutes, That entire fake persona was shattered. Everyone finally saw her as the malicious, calculating criminal she really was. She looked around the table one last time, desperately searching for anyone to take her side. But nobody would even meet her eyes. Even her own brother, Uncle David, slowly turned his chair away from her in total disgust. With shaking hands, she grabbed her designer bag, leaving all her fake evidence sitting right there on the table. When she stood up, her perfect posture completely crumbled. She honestly looked 10 years older than when she first walked in. She walked out of the dining room and slowly made her way down the hall. She stepped out the front door without saying another word. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, and the sound just echoed through the silent house. After she left, the dinner party pretty much instantly dissolved. People quietly grabbed their coats, whispering apologies and shocked condolences to me. Nobody really knew what to say, so they just slipped out into the night. When the last guest was finally gone, Mark and I were left alone in the ruins of the evening. We went into the living room, and the weight of it all just hit him. He collapsed onto the sofa, put his head in his hands, and just started weeping. I didn't rush over to comfort him right away. I just stood there and let him cry. He needed to feel the absolute crushing weight of what he'd done. Eleanor was the villain, sure, but Mark was the one who handed her the weapon. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were totally red and swollen. He just begged for my forgiveness. He kept saying how incredibly sorry he was for not believing me and for giving her that key. He swore he'd cut her off completely. I looked at the man I loved, the guy who almost let my entire life get destroyed. I told him I loved him, but love just wasn't enough anymore. The trust in our marriage was completely shattered. I laid out my terms right then and there. We were starting counseling and changing the locks the very next morning. I told him if he ever spoke to that woman again, I was gone. He agreed to everything without a second thought. It's been 2 years since that insane dinner party, and Mark actually kept his word. He changed his number, and we put in a massive new security system. He hasn't spoken a single word to his mother since the night he kicked her out. The family fallout was absolutely massive. Aunt Carol and Uncle David cut Eleanor off completely. Her precious reputation was totally ruined. Now she just lives alone in that giant, immaculate house, completely isolated by her own toxic obsession. Mark and I had to put in some serious work to rebuild our marriage. We went through months of intense therapy just to fix that foundation of trust. But we actually did it. Our home finally feels like a real sanctuary. Looking back, I'm not even angry anymore. I just feel incredibly empowered. So here's lesson 1. Your intuition is your absolute best protector. When things start feeling off, you gotta listen to it. Heads up, toxic people thrive when you keep giving them the benefit of the doubt. Lesson 2. Silence and strategy are way more powerful than getting angry. Confronting a narcissist just gives them a stage to spin the story. Instead, go totally quiet and gather your evidence. The best weapon against a liar is silent, undeniable proof. And lesson 3, the people who truly love you will always protect your peace. If a partner dismisses your boundaries to keep their toxic family happy, they're choosing their comfort over your safety. You deserve someone who is your absolute shield. The diary is closed. It's funny how quiet life gets when you finally cut out the noise. For so long, my own house felt like a literal battlefield. It was a place where I constantly had to look over my shoulder. But now, the silence isn't heavy or suffocating. It's just peaceful. It's the kind of peace you only really appreciate after you've had to fight tooth and nail for it. Mark and I still have our moments, obviously. Rebuilding a foundation that cracked takes a lot of time. It takes patience and a whole lot of grace. But the difference now is that it's just us. There are no ghosts in the hallway, no hidden agendas, and nobody pulling the strings from the shadows. As for Eleanor, I don't check up on her. I really don't need to. The punishment for someone who needs to control everything is being left with absolutely nothing to control. She built her own prison out of pride and jealousy. And now she's got to live in it, completely alone. And honestly, I don't feel sorry for her.
My sister Sarah still jokes that she should have spilled that red wine at the wedding dress fitting.
Sometimes I think she's right, but Sarah was the anchor I needed when I thought I was drifting. But doing it this way was the only real option. Letting the cold, hard truth speak for itself. It was the only way to make sure the mask never went back on. So if you're out there listening to this, if you're feeling like you're losing your mind because someone's playing games with your reality, take a deep breath. Trust yourself. Protect your space at all costs. And never, ever let anyone make you feel like a guest in your own life. When you finally clear the toxic smoke from your life, you realize how much energy you spent just trying to breathe. My design business didn't just recover. It flourished. Without that constant anxiety, my creativity came rushing back. Rebuilding a marriage after a massive betrayal isn't like flipping a switch. It takes showing up every single day to do the hard work. Mark and I spent months in therapy. We had to unlearn all our defensive habits. It's the quiet moments that tell you the healing is real. A cup of coffee brought to my desk. A peaceful morning without dread. We finally learned how to just be together again, without her ghost hovering. Mark had to grieve the mother he thought he had, and I gave him space for that. But in return, he became the absolute shield I needed. Our home is our sanctuary now, and our boundaries are iron. As for the things she left behind, we purged all of it. That hideous antique clock she forced on us? Boxed up and donated. We didn't want a single physical reminder of her manipulation in our safe haven. Sometimes I walk through the house late at night, just listening to the quiet. It used to terrify me, but it's not that suffocating silence of waiting for the next shoe to drop anymore. It's a comforting stillness. I don't check the security cameras obsessively anymore. They're just there to protect us from strangers now, not family. The psychological house of mirrors she built is gone, replaced by a home built on absolute truth. People ask if I ever worry she'll try to come back or spin the story again. But the truth is, she has no power left. The evidence is permanent. Her isolation is her own doing, and the book is closed. Writing all of this down, it was never about revenge. It was about taking my reality back and owning my story. It was about closing the book on a dark chapter and proving to myself that I survived. So if you're fighting your own quiet war against someone who wants to make you feel crazy, keep going. Trust your gut, gather your proof, and never apologize for protecting your peace. You are stronger than their illusions. You've got this. Lesson 3. The people who truly love you will protect your peace, even if it means standing up to their own blood. The hardest part of this entire ordeal wasn't Eleanor's betrayal. It was Mark's initial failure to protect our boundaries. A partner who dismisses your discomfort just to keep the peace with their toxic family is choosing their comfort over your safety. True love requires the courage to draw hard lines in the sand. If someone wants to share a life with you, they have got to be willing to defend that life against anyone who threatens it. No matter who they are. You deserve a partner who is your absolute shield. And honestly, you should never ever settle for less than that. Your peace is worth it. Stay strong. Protect your sanctuary. And always remember that karma has the final word. The diary is closed.